forced into the darkness. The basement air was thick, tasting of stagnant water and old, copper-scented blood. A single, guttering torch mounted to a weeping stone wall cast long, frantic shadows that seemed to dance with the agonizing rhythm of the screams echoing from the far corner of the dungeon. Rachel pressed her back against the cold, damp masonry, her hands locked in rusted iron shackles that bit into her wrists. Every time she tugged, the cold metal hummed, a vibration that felt like a needle pressed into her marrow. Beside her, Sarah was curled into a tight ball, her chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. She had stopped sobbing 10 minutes ago, but her eyes remained wide, fixed on the carnage unfolding 20 feet away. Mark was playing with them. Not with them, Rachel realized with a jolt of ice in her stomach, but with their friends. "Look at him, Rachel," Mark's voice purred, cutting through the damp darkness. He was leaning over Tommy, the quarterback of their track team, who was pinned to a wooden table by two hulking, faceless thralls. Mark held a jagged, obsidian-bladed knife, turning it so it caught the dim torchlight. He was so fast. The star of the school. Did you know he begged? He didn't even care about his own life. He was begging for yours. Tommy's face was a mask of bruises and blood, his eyes darting toward the girls with a frantic, animal terror. When he tried to speak, only a wet, choking sound emerged. "Stop it," Rachel rasped. Her voice was cracked, devoid of the bravado that had brought them to this island. "Kill me. Leave them out of this." Mark laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He sauntered over, the tip of his blade tracing a line through the grime on the floor. He stopped a foot away, his red hair matted with sweat, his eyes glowing with an unnatural, hungry luminescence. He leaned in, the smell of ozone and rot radiating off him. "Kill you? And waste the potential?" Mark leaned closer, his breath cold against Rachel's ear. "David has plans for you. You aren't just snacks. You're vessels. But your friends, they aren't quite sturdy enough for the ritual. So, they serve a different purpose. They become the foundation. The mortar that holds our little home together." Behind Mark, a muffled, wet snap echoed through the room. A strangled cry erupted from Tommy, then silence. Sarah shrieked, a high, thin sound that sounded like glass breaking. She lunged forward, the chains rattling violently, but she was jerked back by the weight of her bonds. "Tommy. Oh God, no." "See?" Mark straightened, gesturing toward the shadowy figure now dragging Tommy's limp, unresponsive form toward the darkened crawlspace beneath the furnace. "The transition is so much smoother when they're broken. It's like pouring wine into a cracked glass. The contents spill everywhere, it's beautiful." He turned his attention to another of their classmates, Elena, who was being held upright by a thrall near a rack of rusted hooks. Elena was staring at a blank space on the wall, her eyes vacant, a thin line of drool running down her chin. She had been broken an hour ago. The light of her personality had been snuffed out, replaced by the hollow, glassy stare of a soul that had been folded in on itself until it snapped. "You're monsters," Sarah choked out, her voice trembling with a rage that barely masked her paralyzing fear. "You think you're so powerful, but you're just sadists. You're terrified of your own shadows." Mark stepped toward Sarah, his expression darkening. He didn't smile this time. He grabbed a lock of her hair, twisting it until Sarah winced, her head forced back against the stone. "We are the apex," Mark hissed. "We are the silence between heartbeats. You think you understand fear? You haven't even tasted the appetizer." He shoved her head against the wall, a dull thud that made Rachel's vision swim with sympathetic pain. He turned back to the center of the room, where a large, stone circle had been etched into the floor, glowing with a faint, sickly violet light that seemed to pulse in time with the house's foundation. "Jack!" Mark shouted toward the shadows. "The preparations are complete. Bring the rest." The master grows impatient. More thralls emerged from the darkness. They were shells of people, the lost hikers, the missing locals, now stripped of memory and will, their skin gray and translucent, their movements mechanical and predatory. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying fluidity, dragging the remaining boys toward the ritual circle. Rachel watched as Dave, her lab partner, was tossed onto the cold stone. He didn't fight back. He didn't even look up. He just waited, his spirit clearly eroded by hours of whispering voices and psychological battering. "Why?" Rachel whispered, mostly to herself. "Why are you doing this?" "Because history is a circle," a new voice boomed from the shadows, a voice that held the weight of centuries. David stepped into the light. He looked nothing like the legends. He wasn't a caped caricature. He wore a sharp, tailored suit that looked completely out of place in the damp basement, his dark hair slicked back. He possessed a terrifying, regal stillness. He didn't move like a predator. He moved like a king surveying his garden. He walked to the center of the circle, his eyes locking onto Rachel's with a weight that felt like physical pressure. "Humanity is a chaotic, messy experiment, Rachel," David said, his voice smooth and calm. "It's a brief, flickering spark that burns itself out in 80 short years. We offer permanence. We offer a seat at the table of the eternal. But eternity requires structural integrity." He gestured to the room, to the broken bodies of their friends. They were too weak. They crumbled under the pressure of the transformation. But you too? You have a spark. A stubborn, defiant refusal to let go of your breath. That is exactly what I need to stabilize the power I've been harvesting. He stepped toward them, his movements so fast he was a blur of motion. One moment he was by the circle, the next he was standing directly in front of Rachel, his fingers cool and firm as he tipped her chin up. "You aren't going to be thralls," David whispered, his eyes searching hers for a crack in her resolve. "You are going to be the pillars. And if you have to watch your friends die to ensure your transformation takes hold, then so be it." He glanced at Mark. "Proceed. The ritual must begin before the tide returns." "Wait." Rachel cried out, the desperation finally breaking through the wall of terror. "If you turn us, what makes you think we'll obey you? If you make us monsters, we'll kill you." David's lip curled into a thin, enigmatic smile. He leaned in so close their noses touched, his eyes reflecting the flickering, violet light of the circle. "That," he whispered, "is exactly what I'm counting on. A tool that hates its master is the sharpest blade of all." He signaled to the thralls. They grabbed Rachel and Sarah by the arms, the iron cuffs burning as they were wrenched from the wall. The girls were dragged, feet scraping against the uneven stone, toward the pulsing, violet center of the room. As they were forced onto their knees at the edge of the ritual circle, the air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. Rachel looked at Sarah, whose eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming down her face. Rachel reached out, her fingers finding Sarah's, weaving their knuckles together. She didn't know if they would survive the next hour, but as David stepped onto the stone to begin the invocation, Rachel felt a cold, sharp resolve harden in her chest. She wouldn't break. She would be the blade. The basement air was thick with the scent of ozone and drying blood. Rachel's wrists were raw, the iron cuffs biting deep into her skin, leaving dark, weeping welts. Beside her, Sarah slumped, her breathing jagged and shallow. They were suspended by chains from the ceiling, their toes barely brushing the damp, uneven stone of the floor. Above them, the ritual space was a masterpiece of profane geometry. David stood in the center, his long, ink-stained fingers tracing patterns in the air, weaving a web of shadow that pulsed with a sick, rhythmic light. "Look closely, my darlings." David's voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated in Rachel's teeth. "Humanity is so fragile. A little pressure, a little darkness, and they simply unravel." He gestured with a flick of his wrist. Mark stepped out from the gloom, dragging a trembling boy, Jason, toward the central altar. Jason was a wreck, his shirt torn to ribbons, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror that Rachel knew mirrored her own. "No!" Rachel screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. "Leave him alone. Take me, just leave him out of it." Mark chuckled, a wet, grating sound. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he forced Jason down onto the slab, his grip like a vice. "You don't understand the alchemy of grief," David said, pacing toward the girls. He stopped inches from Rachel, his eyes burning with an ancient, predatory hunger. "To truly change, you must lose everything that makes you you. That stubborn curiosity you hold so dear? That fire? It's a liability. We are going to burn it out of you." "You're a monster," Sarah choked out, her voice trembling. David turned, his expression one of mild disappointment. "I am an architect, Sarah. I am merely refining the raw material." He gestured again. This time, he didn't use his hands. The shadows themselves lashed out. They coiled around Jason's throat, lifting him, exposing him. Mark unsheathed a jagged, blackened blade. It didn't shimmer, it seemed to drink the meager light in the room. "Watch," David commanded. It was clinical, precise, and agonizingly slow. Mark didn't kill Jason, he dismantled his resolve. He whispered things into the boy's ear, promises of power, threats of eternal torment, illusions of his own friends betraying him. Then, with a surgical flick of the blade, Mark opened a vein. The room erupted into a symphony of suffering. As Jason's life force seeped into the stone, David caught the essence, guiding the crimson ribbons into a swirling vortex above the altar. Rachel tried to close her eyes, but a cold, unseen force pried them open. She watched as her friend's spirit broke, his screams morphing into the hollow, vacant whimpers of a thrall. "He is clay now," David murmured, watching the transformation. "Empty. Obedient. A blank slate for the Queen's design." "Why?" Rachel sobbed, tears cutting through the grime on her face. "Why do this to us?" "Because you are special," David replied, his tone shifting to something almost gentle, which made it all the more terrifying. "You possess a latent resistance, a defiance that our kind lacks. When you are turned, you won't just be fledglings. You will be vessels. The Queen needs soldiers who can walk in the sun, who can infiltrate the mundane world without being detected. You are the keys to a new era." Mark stepped away from the lifeless, soulless shell that had been Jason. He wiped his blade on his trousers, grinning at Rachel with predatory teeth. "He was a bit flimsy, didn't you think? Broke under the weight of the dark before I could even get to the marrow." "You sick bastard," Sarah snarled, her voice gaining a sharp, jagged edge of pure, unadulterated hatred. David ignored them, turning his focus to the vortex of energy he had harvested. It pulsed violently, a volatile mix of stolen life and dark sorcery. He began to chant, the words ancient and grating, words that felt like they were scraping against the very foundation of reality. The room began to shake. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The chains binding Rachel and Sarah began to glow with an icy, blue light. "The transition is not a gift," David warned, his voice growing distant as the ritual reached its zenith. "It is a violent intrusion. Your blood will boil. Your memories will be rewritten. And by the time the sun rises on the mainland, the girls who came to this island to prove a point will be nothing more than a memory, whispered by the wind." Mark moved toward them now, holding 2 vials filled with a thick, pulsating black liquid. He looked at David. "Ready for the infusion?" "Proceed," David commanded. "And see that they don't break too soon. I want them aware for every second of the tearing." Mark approached Rachel first. He grabbed her jaw, his cold fingers bruising her skin, and forced her mouth open. The smell of the liquid was suffocating, like old graves and stagnant water. "Drink it in," Mark whispered, his breath cold against her cheek. "Let it become your heartbeat." As he poured the liquid down her throat, Rachel felt a fire ignite in her veins. It wasn't just hot, it was consuming. It felt like needles made of ice being driven into every nerve ending, shattering her internal structure and rebuilding it from the inside out. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark, heavy air of the chamber. Beside her, Sarah was suffering the same fate. Rachel watched, her vision blurring into a haze of red and black, as Sarah's body convulsed, her skin turning a translucent, sickly pale as the transformation took hold. The world tilted. The screams of her past self felt miles away, detached, as if she were watching someone else die. And in a way, she was. The human girl, the girl who loved the thrill of a dare and the comfort of a friendship, was being burned away, replaced by something hungry, something cold, something utterly and terrifyingly new. David stood back, his arms crossed, a thin, satisfied smile gracing his lips. He watched the girls thrash against the chains, his eyes reflecting the dark power he had unleashed. Yes, he whispered to the shadows. The vessel is taking form. The hunt is about to begin. Rachel felt her heart stutter, then slow to a rhythmic, heavy thud that was entirely foreign. The pain began to subside, replaced by a sudden, jarring clarity. The shadows in the corners of the room were no longer just absences of light. They had texture, depth, and sound. She could hear the skittering of beetles in the walls, the distant, crashing tide against the island's jagged rocks, and most of all, the rhythmic pulse of David's black heart. She looked at Mark. The sadism in his expression was no longer something to fear, it was something to analyze, a weakness in his posture that she suddenly, instinctively, knew how to exploit. The transformation was complete. They were no longer captives. They were predators, waiting for the chains to break. The air in the dungeon had grown thick, saturated with the coppery, cloying scent of blood and something ozone-sharp, the smell of magic tearing through reality. David stood at the center of the basalt dais, his hands tracing intricate, glowing sigils into the very air. The light from his fingertips burned with a sickly, bruised violet hue, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the damp stone walls. Rachel felt the cold before she felt the pain. It wasn't the temperature of the room, but a void opening inside her chest, a hollow space where her warmth used to be. She was lashed to a vertical slab of jagged obsidian, her wrists raw and bleeding from the silver filigree manacles that bit deep into her skin. Across from her, Sarah hung in a similar state. Her head lolled, her dark hair matted with sweat and grime, but her eyes, wide and glassy, and filled with a terror that was quickly curdling into something colder, remained fixed on David. "Look at them," David whispered, his voice smooth, devoid of any genuine empathy. He gestured toward the floor, where the bodies of their friends lay, broken and still. "They were the anchors, Rachel. The final threads of your human tether. Once I sever them, you will have nothing to return to. Nothing to mourn. Only the hunger." Mark leaned against a stone pillar nearby, his red hair damp with the spray of recent violence. He watched the proceedings with a predator's idle curiosity, sharpening a long, curved blade against his palm. Every time the metal cut his skin, it healed instantly, a mocking display of the immortality he now intended to force upon them. "Stop it," Sarah rasped, her voice cracking. It was a plea, but even to her own ears, it sounded thin, pathetic. "Please. Just kill us." David laughed, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in Rachel's teeth. "Death is a mercy, Sarah. And you two are far too exquisite to be wasted in the dirt. You are the vessels. The foundation." He began to chant. It wasn't a language of men. It sounded like grinding stones and the screech of rusted hinges. As the syllables spilled from his lips, the obsidian slab beneath Rachel hummed. The vibration traveled up her spine, turning her bones to lead. She tried to scream, but the air was sucked from her lungs, replaced by a sudden, freezing pressure that forced her to gasp. "Mark," David commanded without looking away from the swirling violet vortex above the altar. "Begin the binding." Mark pushed off the pillar, his movements fluid and unervingly fast. He walked to Rachel, his face inches from hers. He smelled of old graves and expensive cologne. With a sharp tug, he ripped the silver manacles from the wall. Rachel slumped, But Mark caught her by the throat, his grip like a vice. He didn't choke her. He held her firmly, his thumb pressing against the pulse point of her neck. "It's going to burn," Mark whispered, his eyes flashing with a predatory amber light. "The transition doesn't happen in the blood, princess. It happens in the soul." He leaned in, his fangs extending with a wet, sickening click. Rachel thrashed, her boots scuffing against the stone floor, but she was impossibly weak. The magic in the room had drained her, leaving her like a rag doll. Mark sank his teeth into her neck. The sensation wasn't just pain. It was an invasion. It felt as though liquid fire was being injected directly into her veins, searing through her heart, melting the very architecture of her humanity. She shrieked, a sound that tore at her throat, but it was drowned out by the roar of the ritual. She saw images flashing behind her eyelids, the faces of her parents, a blurred memory of a childhood birthday, the sun rising over the bay, all of it turning to ash, dissolving into a monochromatic landscape of shadow and instinct. Across the room, Jack, the vampire with the Irish lilt, had moved to Sarah. The sound of Sarah's frantic, ragged breathing turned into a high-pitched, guttural keen as she was subjected to the same agonizing process. David raised his hands, the violet light coalescing into a sphere of pure, crackling energy. He slammed it down onto the stone floor between them. A shockwave tore through the room. Rachel felt her skin split and knit back together in the span of a heartbeat. Her eyes, once soft and brown, flared with a blinding, predatory luminescence. The world shifted. She could see the heat signatures of the vampires, the frantic, fading heartbeat of a dying friend on the floor, the microscopic cracks in the foundation of the house. The hunger hit her next, a physical weight, a violent, clawing demand that turned her stomach inside out. It was an insatiable, roaring void that screamed for life force, for heat, for blood. It was so overwhelming that the trauma of the transformation began to fade behind the singular, blinding necessity of feeding. David stepped back, watching them with the clinical gaze of an architect admiring a finished structure. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing in their newly heightened hearing. "The humanity you cling to is a fragile lie. You are no longer girls who went for a midnight sail. You are predators. You are the night." Sarah collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest, her fingers digging into her own skin. She looked at her hands, then at Rachel. Her eyes, now glowing with a faint, ghostly blue hue, were filled with a wild, terrifying realization. She looked at the bodies of their friends, the ones they had come here to protect, and the flicker of grief was instantly eclipsed by the sharp, metallic tang of blood pooling on the cold floor. Rachel could feel the blood. It was everywhere. It was the loudest thing in the room. Mark released his hold on Rachel, stepping back to admire his work. He wiped a smear of her blood from his lip, grinning. "She's a fighter, David. I think she's going to be a problem." David walked over to Rachel, lifting her chin with a cold, pale finger. She stared at him, the urge to rip his throat out warring with an inexplicable, terrifying sense of obedience that the ritual had etched into her marrow. She fought it, every fiber of her being recoiling from his touch, yet her body remained frozen, locked in the thrall of his sorcery. "A problem is exactly what I need," David said softly. He gestured to the room, to the desecrated space where they had been broken. "The world thinks the war is over. It thinks the shadows were banished long ago. You two are going to be the ones to remind them why they fear the dark." Sarah stood up, her movements jerky and stiff, like a marionette learning to walk. She looked at Rachel, her expression a mask of horror and newfound, terrifying grace. "Rachel?" Sarah whispered. Her voice had changed. It was deeper, resonant with a power that didn't belong to a high school student. Rachel tried to answer, but her own voice emerged as a growl, a low, rasping sound that rattled in her chest. She looked down at her own reflection in a puddle of spilled wine near the altar. The face looking back was hers, but the eyes, the hollow, hungry, immortal eyes, were a stranger's. The transition was complete. The girl she had been died on that floor, and in her place stood something sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Get them ready," David commanded, turning toward the heavy iron doors of the basement. "We have a kingdom to reclaim, and they have a hunger to sate." As the vampires circled them, Rachel looked at Sarah, and for a fleeting second, through the thick, suffocating fog of their new nature, they shared a single, desperate thought: this isn't over. But as the hunger surged again, rising up like a tidal wave, even that thought began to drown.